So I'm going to pass over to Jane Perrone, who's hosting a panel session, and we have Dan Pearson, Fergus Garrett, Poppy Ogotcha, and Richard Scott. Over to you guys.
Thank you, Arit. Well, it's wonderful to be here again, and I'm feeling slight imposter syndrome sitting here with this wonderful, wonderful panel. Aren't we lucky to have these 4 people here to talk to us about this topic of our plant palette? And where I thought we would start with this discussion is for those people listening who might be coming to a space for the very first time, perhaps a small space, perhaps a really small space, and wondering about their very first steps in assessing or figuring out how to assess what that plant palette that they want to evolve should be. What are those first steps when you're taking on a new space? How do you know where to begin? Poppy, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, okay.
In at the deep end.
Hi, everyone. So I suppose I can speak to this from a very personal perspective because at the very, very, very beginning when I started growing, I was on a canal boat, and I was growing on the roof of the canal boat. And so now I have a small garden in South Devon, and in both situations, and always, the first thing I do is try to assess what's going on externally to the space so that it's kind of tied into its surrounding area and doesn't become this kind of little island that doesn't have flow between it and externally. So the first thing I would usually do would be kind of come into the space and see how it exists within the surrounding area, and then see how different plants may exist within that surrounding area that could then be brought into the growing space that are potentially good for wildlife, which are obviously thriving in that environment, so it would be a lot easier for me to maintain them. Obviously that's less resources needed if they're just going to do their own thing. And so that's kind of where I begin. And then, of course, considering where the sun moves through the space, how water moves or is collected or pooling or not pooling in the space, how I move through that space as well, and how I can kind of design in a way that is going to be least resource intensive for me. So whether that's me moving less, whether that's making it easier for me to move things about the place, and also trying to encourage me to actually be in the space in a really dynamic way, rather than just kind of being like this external visitor who looks out on it as this separate thing. For me, growing is very, very much about ensuring that the human is as much part of the growing space as all the plants and animals that we're trying to encourage. So those are some of the kind of initial things that I really tend to think about on a bigger scale. And then, of course, what soil is there is also like number one, really, really important. What shade is there, that kind of thing.
Anyone else want to jump in on this? Fergus.
I think, it was a very powerful talk that Mike Edwards gave before, and I think that sort of looking, listening, first of all, to take it in, to get an idea of sense of place, and as Poppy said, looking around you to see what's around you, to try and connect with nature. And I think it's easy enough to say, well, look at a list of pollinators and get all the sort of good pollinator plants, but they may be riddled with pesticides. Who knows? So you've got to be careful there. So that's the pitfall. So I think you have to go deeper than this. It isn't just about a pollen and nectar source. It's about things need a place to live, to breed, and to feed. So it's about habitats and structures as well, So you could have a list of pollinator plants, but you need shelter there as well. You need porous walls and water, maybe bare ground and full ground and so on, and places for detritivores to live in. So I think that just comes step by step by step. I think you need to throw away the chemicals for a start, that's for sure. And then just try and read what's there and try and create habitats as well as giving a food source for plants. And what we've done is that we've mixed natives with exotics and thought about a long season as well. The crocuses are important for the queen bumblebees that come out of hibernation, as are the North American perennials that flower late, important for that late crop of plants. But
this non-native, native debate is probably taking up quite a lot of our thoughts, and it has already been discussed at the conference. Is it a red herring, or is it something we need to really get to the bottom of? Dan or Fergus, do you want to?
I think it's important to always think about there being an inclusion of natives wherever you're working. So just going back to that whole contextualizing where you are, that's something I'll always do, is look at what's in the area, what's useful, what can drive a place in terms of capturing the spirit of place, and also what's endemic to that area. But then I think it's really about just making sure that you have this opportunity of there being a mix of things to extend the season of the natives. And that's one of the great things about gardens, is that right now, for instance, our meadows that we've had cut are silenced, and it's only the rough places that we leave beyond them that have still got that biodiverse environment left behind. But the garden is still continuing to pump all this energy. And we've got so much life in there as a result. And just going back to our previous talk, if you walk from those silent meadows now into the garden, like the feeling, once you recalibrate and listen, is completely different because of the energy of all the things which are attracted to that. So I think it's about there being a balance between the two. And I think, we're lucky enough to be able to work in different places. So I'm always trying to encourage like if we're working in California, for instance, the range of natives that you've got there are so incredible, and people tend to turn their back on natives because they're just all around you. They're not the special thing, but if you use them in a special way, and often alongside things which might be exotic but adaptive to that environment, you then get people to recalibrate and see what's underneath their noses differently.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Richard, do you want to come in here?
I would like to say always the obvious, always the great surprise, really. In terms of the people I've met and known, great guy in Liverpool who was probably the father of ecological restoration was a guy called Tony Bradshaw. And I think there is a clash of worlds here. I'm used to my influences and references across the paths of great gardeners, and it's wonderful to do that. But, it's people like, for example, how many of you know about Philip Grime in Sheffield, who was the one who really talked about, in plant strategy terms, stress, and a wonderful terminology which was called Grime's humpback, which was this peak of peak of biodiversity, which related to different kinds of stress and the importance of the soils and the substrates and the starting points. Now, Tony Bradshaw would always take a spade with him, and he'd have a prog with his spade and make sure that he knew what the soil was like. But it is this thing about we are very privileged. Jennifer Owen was mentioned yesterday. What she did was, that bit wasn't mentioned. She actually applied for her garden to be a nature reserve, an SSSI. And it nearly got it, and then they realised it was a garden, and that took it out of the system. So you can do wonderful things, and we've heard witness to that. And I think it is about, from my experience in Liverpool, it's particularly, it was always about the unlikely places. So the places in your garden, which hopefully are probably a bit more sunny because there's more opportunity in the sunshine, might be where there's a base for an old greenhouse, or there's bricks, or there's other waste materials, which relates to bigger pictures, and John's going to talk about that after lunch. But I think it is this thing about maybe thinking, I don't like the phrase out of the box particularly, but it's that way of being counterintuitive. And this, beside me, is a charter I took to the World Soil Congress, supported and commented on by peer groups which are largely ecologists, but does touch upon gardening. And it is this point about the way we target the soil and the starting point particularly. Because many of you will know, particularly in the wildflower story, particularly on richer soils, the management effort is greater. Those wonderful ecological gardeners in Amstelveen we've had a really great relationship with in Holland. They weed with penknives. We took a group from Liverpool, and they actually came back to Liverpool and talked to parks groups, which was wonderful. But I remember this group from Liverpool, they were they saw this area of bare ground, and they said to the Dutch, "But where are your hoes?" And this guy, like Crocodile Dundee, pulled out actually quite a little penknife, and they wouldn't believe him at first. So to do it in richer soils, you have to put in more grafts, because there's this, like more productivity, and to keep the precious things, the more biodiverse landscapes, it needs less fertility, and that's the opportunity for less management. So it's this wonderful balance, but I would like to encourage anybody, because it is an adventure, it's a journey, but it's also about how you link to other people. We're thinking about garden communities, and the wonderful way we can merge these different disciplines, I think is really, really exciting right now, and the way we can link to food growing and other instances. So, enjoy it, have fun, be prepared to play. Bob Dylan actually said, there's no success like failure, and failure is no success at all.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's a great journey. But sunny spots are easier. But, you choose your plants, you choose your favourites, have a go. Urban places, gardens are cosmopolitan places. We shouldn't get too prescriptive. There's a great guy called John Rodwell, who's actually, I know, been staying at Great Dixter, who is the architect of the National Vegetation Classification, which is all the habitats across the British Isles. And I know he would say, don't be too prescriptive. He talked about a tyranny of typologies. So have fun.
Yeah. And it was interesting. Yeah, well done. And wasn't it interesting that, I love Dave, and I'm a great admirer of his work and his research and so on, but it was interesting that Dave said that Jenny Owen's garden was probably, of the places that have been studied, probably the most biodiverse place in the UK in terms of species count, and that's a garden. She didn't create fake nature, as Ken Thompson calls it. It was an ornamental garden. It's a small garden, but it was just studied over 30 years, 2,673 species. So, gardens have got a part to play in this, as natives and exotics rubbing shoulders together and those sort of habitats. And I think what Richard said is also really exciting, because there was a man called Patrick Roper who did a study on a square meter. I think he had a log and a brick and a plastic bottle with water in it, and he studied the insects that came into that. Insects live a chemical life, so they'll find every little nook and cranny. So this thing is full of surprises. If you walk around Dixter, there's bare ground where the turf has been worn away, the grass has been worn away. And years ago, we would have turfed those up or reseeded those areas. But those bare areas, which, and we took some head gardeners around there and were shocked at the state of our grass. But those bare areas are home to the most incredible mining bees and solitary bees and so on. So, I think educating yourself is quite important. I think that one of the greatest things that happened to us at Dixter was that we got into bed with an ecologist, with an entomologist, ecologist, and saw the garden through their eyes. There was a group of them, but there's one person in particular, and we saw it through his eyes, and his brain was wired slightly differently. He says that he sent me a text saying our brains are wired differently. So he saw the garden in a different way. And Dan, I'm sure you'll mention the sort of the woodland edge ecotone that you talked about a couple of days ago when we had that conversation. But he saw the garden as woodland edge, but he also saw it as soft cliff as well, elements of soft cliff, and that's a threatened element. Is very diverse. It's home to a range of insects that like the disturbance. And he was looking at our earth paths and the vegetation that we cut down or take away and put back in the bare soil. And he said that mimics soft cliff vegetation. He said it's really interesting. And then he was finding familiar species that the habitat's there, but they're also in the soft cliffs in Hastings. And it's fascinating, the whole thing.
I think it was interesting what you just said about using the word cosmopolitan garden being a cosmopolitan place, because it sort of ties into various things we've been listening to yesterday. And if you think about the design of cities, for instance, in a way, when we're making a garden, we should be enabling as many other life forms to be living there, right the way through from the things that are underneath the soil and supporting us through the soil, through all those niches that, you know, we may overlook by being too fastidious or too keen on order. And it's really about recalibrating how we, as gardeners, as custodians of those places, however big they can be tiny, what our role is. You know, we are probably needing to fit in more lightly. And I mean, I think it's brilliant, this conference, because it just brings all these ideas together. And the point about listening, you know, once you start to see how we fit in, you know, our role in that needs to be much more subservient in a way to facilitating the other things that are there as part of the environment that we're helping to create. So as gardeners and designers, you know, we've got a responsible role in a way to be thinking about all those different layers and things which might not be automatically pretty to look at. You know, you talk about rewilding, and rewilding is often, people can look at it and be fearful. Sarah pointed to that point, you know, of how do you make somewhere feel less frightening and actually somewhere a little bit scary, you know, even if it's just a tiny corner that you've left, is not a bad thing at all, because there are all these other things going on in there.
Are we in danger of focusing on the charismatic garden wildlife, the robin and the hedgehog, which obviously we do need to protect, but and paying less attention to what's happening at soil level and soil health and soil ecology, plus all those invertebrates? As you say, Fergus, how knowledgeable are we about all those many creatures? How do we change that?
You read this brilliant quote out to me yesterday.
Yes.
About
I tried to get
a
it
subterranean world.
Yeah, I'll try.
Which was how your ecologist had.
Yeah.
It was really super, because it's about that.
He knew I was coming. He wanted to come, but couldn't get transport to come. This guy, and we've got to get ecologists and gardeners together. You know, marry those two worlds. You know, all of us together. So he said, I mean, I love this guy. He said, his name is Andy Phillips. He said, as with plant communities, you also have succession within invertebrate communities. Before he started that by saying Dixter is ahead of the curve on all of this, because we've been talking to him for years. As with plant communities, you also have succession within invertebrate communities. There are a number of moth species whose larvae feed on the underside of the bark of fallen timber. The feeding activities of these species, as well as deadwood feeding millipede, lift the bark, causing it to fall. This exposes the vacated beetle burrows of Anabilodea species, deathwatch beetle family. These linear burrows are used by stem-nesting bees and wasps, associated parasitoids and inquilines. These will also allow fungi colonization to speed up decomposition and rot-producing softer wood, and allow another community of bees and wasps, which dig more complex branching burrows into the wood. The fallen sawdust and bark from the activity of this pioneering species produces diurnal cover for nocturnal invertebrates such as ground beetles and woodlice, which in turn provide food for insectivorous birds, mammals, amphibians, and reptiles. Some bee hotels are very static in habitats in comparison. So bee hotel design in the future will need to mimic this dynamic, constantly changing succession of invertebrate habitat within log piles. And this all came about because I had a pile of wood that I was going to use as firewood, and he said to me, "Don't burn that." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because see these little furrows made by wood-boring insects? There's a really interesting beetle in there that's only found in 7 other locations in the southeast." So I thought, wow, okay. Then I created all these log piles around Dixter as a result of understanding that habitat.
Yeah.
We're all going to have to become Janes, aren't we?
Yeah.
Not do anything.
Yeah. So it's so you've just seen it through another person's eyes, which was just, for me, it was fascinating. So, and we were talking, Dan and I were talking, and you know, about this, that the garden as a result of understanding the life that's in there, because that life in there was there before the garden was created. It's their place that we're actually, a part of, So every little hole in a dead branch, or those layers of lichen that you get on the stones, or the little holes that we have in the old building at Dixter, and the holes in the ground to stuff that's living on the underside of leaves, etc. All of that, once you understand that life is there, it makes you look at it in a different way, accept things in a different way, and the garden becomes a richer place, and the experience of gardening and being in there becomes a richer experience. Beforehand it was all about combination, succession, combination, scent and sound as well. But now it goes even deeper than all of that. It becomes a much more moving experience.
I think that there's something, I find it so exciting hearing stories like that of the sheer complexity that exists that we possibly have no idea about. And I think that so often, for me, I think of growing and gardening as a kind of relationship with the land where you're kind of like an assistant rather than a kind of controlling force. And I think that in reality, the majority of us are probably never going to have the level of information that we understand all processes at that detail. But knowing that processes do exist to that detail is, I think, in itself really exciting and really invites us to kind of like surrender into the fact that we are only ever going to be able to scratch the surface, and we can only really ever be assistants to these landscapes, and we're kind of like part of it in that capacity rather than this kind of like dominant force. And I think stories like that are just so important in kind of encouraging, I suppose it's a form of rewilding our minds as growers or gardeners. And I think in the world we live in, it is entirely our responsibility to do that, and become really responsible custodians through understanding it's so complicated. And if we sit back in some, if we are to be able to sit back and kind of observe healthy ecosystems and then try to encourage those to emerge in our growing spaces, that can be a really, really powerful thing.
I remember talking to a mite expert and discovering that there are mites that live on slugs, and there's a whole world, and we need more mite experts because there aren't enough people studying mites because they're absolutely incredible. So yes, you can go deep with this stuff, which is fascinating and so enriching. I want to bring food plants in here. Obviously, food plants has different meanings: food for wildlife, food for us. This is an imperative for us all in the current climate to think about how we are interacting and what we might be taking or giving to the land. I want to talk about perennial vegetables because that's a little thing of mine. But Poppy, do you want to come in on food plants?
Yeah, so I think that the interesting thing with growing food is that it really encourages a really dynamic relationship with the land, whereby we're not only kind of cultivating it for auditory or visual experience, but we're like ingesting the produce, literally experiencing its nourishing effects, and it comes out the other end. And arguably, what comes out the other end can be fertility for the next harvest, depending on how you use it. And so for me, food growing becomes this really exciting kind of route into rewilding our minds, rewilding our relationships with land, and understanding how when we tend to land in a way that is rooted in reciprocity, giving and exchange, we receive nourishment in return and the land thrives. So I think that, for me, food growing in our current climate is a really exciting place to kind of explore how we can learn a relationship with land that's not rooted in pure extraction. And one of the many ways that we can do that is exploring perennial growing, because of course it can require a lot less resources, rather than having to sow seeds year on year and having to potentially disturb the soil in order to put your annual veg in. The veg can stay, and there's potential for a more kind of interesting and complex ecosystem to develop that is edible. And it's quite fun because then we get to kind of slip into this like semi-foraging dynamic with our growing space, where it's not like necessarily neat rows, but things can kind of mix together and become a bit more wild.
Does that speak to anyone here about tapestries of plants and bringing in that element of foraging?
I think the layering is really important, that idea that one thing can coexist with another and it be not a static thing, but a constant thing. And we always try and make sure that we're weaving in things that can be of use, whether it's herbs and things have many, many uses. It isn't necessarily just about eating them, it's about things that can make you feel good if you touch them, and a sensual world that's created through planting things in your garden that are about a give and take. So we're always trying to make sure that there's an edible component to our gardens, whether it's using wild strawberries as a ground cover or gooseberries in hedges, or, it's just about pushing the boundaries a little bit. Our hedges at home, because our land used to be a market garden, are full of escapees. So there are currants that are growing in the hedges that were never planted there. It must have been the birds. There are wild gooseberries growing in the hedges. So we've been thinking about there being foraging hedges, so you actually make edible hedges with plum trees emerging from them, and the brambles encouraged, and them being habitats that are working on many, many different layers, whole little ecosystems, which are places we can go to graze, but they're also, of course, fantastic for the things which are living alongside us.
I'd just like to say, because I could give two examples actually, there's the big Anglican Cathedral in Liverpool, which is a fantastic piece of architecture, actually designed by the same guy who designed the red telephone box. And it actually looks a bit like that. But the thing was, we did a project with the Friends of St James's Garden there some years ago, and it involved, a variety of things, snowdrops, a variety of woodland wildflowers, quite a shady spot. But, wild garlic was part of that story, and it was actually started off with seed collected from somewhere in Wales, tended initially as a square and then planted out, and sort of 12 years later it's everywhere, because it's been transplanted and moved. But everybody thinks, or the vast majority of people who go and forage there, which includes the Chinese community, because it's very close to Chinatown in Liverpool, oldest Chinese community in Europe actually, and everybody thinks it's been there for decades, like 100 years, and it's ancient, which is fantastic. But also, in the recent march of wildflowers in resurgence, which I'm really proud of in Liverpool, because there's a long history, but it's sometimes it's like the phoenix coming back, is the fact that food growing projects are linking together in public parks. So, for example, Prince's Park in Liverpool, one of the very early public parks in the world, has had wildflowers for 2 years, which was a revolution. We couldn't have done that 5 years ago because it was Victorian heritage. And there has to be a space for how we reinvent and bring ecology into the 21st century that recognises the Victorians had a vision, health and well-being as big as it is today. Central Park in New York, if you know it or not, was actually blueprinted. They just lifted Birkenhead Park in Birkenhead to Central Park in New York. That was Olmsted. But it's this thing about how you can put these things together. So Squash, the organisation that Gemma actually worked for when she spoke yesterday and mentioned, planting pumpkins and things on the edges of these wildflower plantations, and it's respected. And it's wonderful, these things. It's the juxtaposition, I think, that is critical in these things, in terms of where you can place things in view, which excites people. And they love both.
Yeah. And it's just using that garden. Gardens shouldn't be static places. And so I think that it's all about, in terms of biodiversity, it's all about diversity of actions within a garden as well. And so mixing vegetables or herbs or whatever, that sort of interaction you have with that crop increases the diversity of uses and will no doubt have a part to play in biodiversity as well.
But there must be bigger alliances between ecology and food growers, because it's wonderful, really.
Yeah. Somebody from the audience wanted to ask about the other end of the process from the start point, which is once you've done your planting, how do you actually then assess whether your planting has, how much success have you had in providing homes for wildlife and a good impact on biodiversity? How do you know if it's worked? Who wants to come in? Richard?
Well, it's in practical terms, it's people like entomologists, which Fergus already touched on. But in truth, you have to realise that for us, and it is frustrating when sometimes you hear, the great stories of NEP and stuff, because try and get people to come and visit some of these places in the north of England, or even, like museums are stretched now. Liverpool, the World Museum in Liverpool has actually been very kind to me. But it's really hard to find people to go and look at those places, and it's almost an act of persuasion. It's funding and other things, but it's that leap. I mean, I've seen corncrakes in our project sites on Merseyside, and they probably, didn't stay very long. They were probably on the way from the Isle of Man. Wonderful things happen, and I know from this kind of large-scale project works, I only wish we could do more of that. And I have to say, there is a privilege attached to being here, and thank you very much, Julia, and for being part of this. But there's also a sense of there is, it's very difficult to find the money to do some of this monitoring unless you've got access to funds. And certainly Liverpool City Council can't help us with that one at the moment, I'm afraid. And we would, we're in the business of putting it on the ground, and the proof is in the pudding. And I think that's the key. We have to keep putting it on the ground fast with all the lessons we've known about. And from my experience, I've seen, when we've been growing flowers in big areas, sometimes for crops and harvests, I've seen a perfect square of swifts over a field of cornflower. And these truths, I think, are self-evident. We should prove it when we can. I would love to invite, more Natural England people or anybody to Liverpool, but you try getting them there. We had a National Wildflower Centre which opened 10 years in Liverpool, and we couldn't get any senior person from Natural England to visit, let alone do any recording. So there is, a sense that we are in a difficult place right now. There are really special things happening, which is really exciting, but we have to recognise that, for example, the public parks, I think, in terms of wilding, should be part of that story in a big way. SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, UN Habitat, who I think is probably one of the most proactive of the UN organisations, has said that Sustainable Development Goal 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, is the most important of all the 17 in delivering all the others. Because what is the chance if you don't involve people?
Yeah.
And in a big way. And so the excitement, again, of the way you link communities of gardeners and expertise, which is in this room, to the bigger picture, in the love of the environment and the change of the municipal, which used to be a grand word. And what does it mean now? It means dull and boring.
Yeah.
And
That's good.
You have to turn things on their head, and flip the gardens out.
Yeah. And Rich, because we've been involved with the Hastings project, haven't we? And so we got sort of a tip-off from somebody to say that there's money going for inner city development and sort of deprived areas. And so we set up a team, a really, really exciting team of people in Hastings, and then from experts outside of Hastings. And the vision was to actually work with ecologists, with gardeners, work with the parks, work with communities, allotment holders, create green corridors throughout the town. Work it off all an audit, first of all, so you know what's there and what should be there and how you can enhance that. But create meeting places for people, enhance the parks, enhance the streets, plant more trees, do like they've done in Sheffield, this sort of greater green, have elements of that as well. And work from the outside in, some of those deprived areas, outside, but as well as the city centre out. And I thought it was a brilliant sort of scheme of ideas and just get all the community involved, you know, so not just do it from top down, but from bottom up, you know, because that's the really exciting thing that Rich has been doing for years and years and years, involving these communities. And so what's happened after all that work is that only the town centre's going to be done, you know. And so you need sort of visionaries involved in the decision making to actually, because it seems a no-brainer, this scheme, that you could actually do something really extraordinary in a place like Hastings, which is sort of community and biodiversity led, but only the town centre. I mean, it's going to be very exciting what they do in the town centre, but it wouldn't take a lot of money to do all of that other stuff as well, you know. And so we haven't got there yet.
I think we tend to be all working in silos, don't we?
Yeah.
So there's not enough crossover between disciplines. And when you get that, like in a Venn diagram, you know, when you get the crossover of things, it's often the most interesting places are those crossover places.
Yeah.
And it's about getting that dialogue happening and getting people communicating. So going back to your point, Richard, it's all about the people and the communicating. And you start to see, you get so much bang for your buck if you've got a dialogue happening early on in a project, or midway in a project, or even at the end. You know, it's just, but we tend to all work in these different departments without there being enough crossover happening.
Poppy, I know you've had experiences working with community groups. How does this play out on the ground?
Yeah. Well, I suppose when you asked how do you measure success in a growing space, for me, that's in the world we live in currently, it's how engaged and how in love are people feeling with that space, because ultimately I feel that we really, really need more people who are in love with this kind of work. And so for me, I mean, the project that I'm working on now, called Grow and Share, we're based on a piece of land in South Devon, and the concept is that people get to come and grow their own veg box. And so it's kind of like an exchange of time for food, and they learn how to grow veg ecologically. And for us, the sort of kind of success of that space is the fact that the people are just so invested, like so invested as a group. And it means that it gives us a sense that that place, you know, we're early, very early, it's the first year of doing this project, but we feel that it's going to thrive. And so I think that ultimately, if a space is engaging many different people, then it will thrive, because, you know, we'll be putting our energy into it. So for me, that's the measure for success.
One of the other questions that came in concerned cultivated plants. We've already touched on the native, non-native debate, but this person was asking if there are any sources of measurable data on which particular cultivated plants offer the most benefit to wildlife, so that if you're thinking about a scheme where you want to mix the two together, which plants should you be looking at? Does anyone have any thoughts on this? Obviously, I'm not expecting you to produce a spreadsheet, but
I mean, there will be elements of data out there. I mean, I think you can generalize to say that anything that's in the Apiaceae family it offers a landing pad for a wide range of insects, and the same with alliums as well. You know, from just experience, because I haven't got much experience outside of Dexter, really. I mean, I've sort of worked in other places, and I've seen, you know, I've gone into the wild quite a lot, into the countryside, and to have a look at, that's my great passion, to see wild communities. But just looking at Dexter as an example, you can, you know, some of these shrubs that are flowering now, like Luma apiculata or Myrtus luma, you can't hear yourself think, because it's just so alive with insects. You know, and if you look that up, it's not clear whether it's a good pollinator or not. So it's just being observant, which relates to the previous question. You know, it's about just seeing what's visiting what. And this is, you know, the whole thing's a web, isn't it? So if you've got insects, you're going to have something else. As, you know, Andy Phillips's email said, it's all linked, you know. I was looking at Pileostegia viburnioides with Ben, who's sitting at the top there the other day, and that was just alive with insects as well, hornets and bees and flies and so on. The ivy when it's flowering. So I think so. Then you start registering these things, and you sort of build that element, and of course you get help from other people to guide you in the right way, but also ecologists and local naturalists as well. So it's about gathering information to make those decisions. But those lists of just pollinator plants, they're all okay, but a lot of that information is missing, because certain things are generally good for a wide range and certain things are very specific. And as Dave said, it's not just about pollen and nectar, it's about creating habitats as well, whether something's a good food crop in terms of a leaf, or whether something provides a good habitat because the way it dies and with its hollow stems and so on. So the whole thing is complex. So we need to re-educate ourselves, and like I said before, we all need to work together, especially with ecologists and naturalists, to sort of guide us in the right way so we can make intelligent decisions.
I'm glad you mentioned Pileostegia, because that's my absolute favourite. Yeah. It's outside my kitchen window, and it is absolutely alive. A great plant. Yeah. Who else wants to come in on this?
Just say quickly that we should be thinking successionally. I mean, people were talking about annuals and perennial mixtures. Start them with annuals and sow them with perennials. I mean, there's a long debate about that in terms of the whole evolution of the wildflower seed industry. A guy called Terry Wells, who was originally at the Institute of Terrestrial Ecology, initially came up with what is a meadow? So it's 20% wildflowers, 80% grass. It didn't necessarily mean the best thing to do was sow a mix of 80% grass with 20% of wildflowers.
Sure.
And I'm sure if Terry Wells was alive today, he would say that. But that got trapped as an industry standard. I wouldn't sow a mixture with grass, to be quite honestly. We've for a long time, and in terms of certainly supplying seed and being involved in the early seed industry, we always advise people use annuals as a nurse crop, take it through a succession, and sow it with different perennials. And you can be very clever with those which you choose. But the other thing is, don't denigrate the annuals. John Rodwell would tell you, he did a red habitat book for Europe. What is one of the most rarest habitats in Europe today? Those arable weed habitats. And I remember arguing in 2005 at a biodiversity fair actually in Sheffield, and it was one of those events where it was a DEFRA organised event, and they asked the DEFRA representatives to stand up, and the crop margin guy stood up. And I thought, I'll go and have a word with him. And I tried at the time to persuade them that we could take on maybe 10% of the field margin target. Why not add them all together? Do it in the benefit. And it could be a rural area or an urban area. If they'd done that in the places where people could see them, in villages or towns, or even a small percentage, there would have been huge awareness. And to be honest, a lot of the European money that people didn't realise was being spent in the same way. People didn't make the connection between the spend and what you could do with the money. And there's some great projects probably done with that kind of funding. But one, people weren't really involved. And two, they just didn't know where these projects were often. There was not that connection. The exciting thing for me is when you get big groups of people out and sow the seed, and when they come back and start to see the results from themselves. We had a great project in Bootle. Ken Dodd said that's where Shakespeare bought his first biro. But it's that thing. People start, and we had a small group of people who were effectively wildflower rangers who tagged along when we went and we started pointing out the seedlings as they germinated. That's the kind of momentum that's needed. It wasn't difficult, and we did it with quite a small package of funding, and it becomes exciting. So we're flying in Liverpool with Scouse Flower House. We're also talking about a northern flower house rather than a northern powerhouse, which people are actually quite offended by. But it is this excitement of watching a succession, which I think is important and fits in with, I think.
And I think it's important that we endeavour, just in terms of the education, to know how things are connected. We had a moth survey done this year, and the first thing that the guys were saying is, here's our largest moth turned up, the privet hawk moth. Yeah. It's huge, amazing thing that we hadn't really even clocked. And then, of course, the first thing they were saying is, and the host plant for this is, and once you start then making the connection, I thought, oh, I'm so glad I've been planting wild privet in our hedgerows. And I'm sure it's not just down to me having done that, but as soon as you know that, you then start to care more about the connection between things. So if we see everything in isolation, an umbrella for all on its own, it's not at all the same as if you see what it's supporting, what it likes to grow with, and then the connections that can be made through those little ecosystems. So you start to immediately join something up, so your line doesn't ever stop when you're drawing it. It just keeps on going from one thing to the next. And I think informing yourself about how those things cross over and what the connections are enables you to then think more connectively. And therefore you then start to get this. The whole thing is exponential. It's just an enormous web that we're just part of.
You can get amazing things. For example, Echium vulgare, which was mentioned as one of the best sort of attractive plants for pollinators. We try and encourage in Everton Park, which is a fantastic, best view of the Liverpool city, and actually won Q's England flagship by public vote. But it was Carl Linnaeus' one of his favourite plants, and he didn't actually document his favourite plants very much. There's not many references to individual species, but he said there was nothing to surpass a field of Viper's bugloss. And there is like an audible buzz in those places when you walk through them. And the truth is, you can imagine Carl Linnaeus walking down Everton Park and whistling, as I'm sure he would. But now football fans walk through those areas which were originally cornfield annuals. There's these cycles of biennials and other things. But, in the spring, when Liverpool were playing big matches, what happens is there's this string of people that walk from Lime Street and the city centre through Everton to Anfield, or Everton, both. And that could be 20,000 people. And they were walking past cowslips where there'd been cornfield annuals 4 years before, and then there's a succession of other species. And that's magical, I have to say.
Yeah.
I want to try to slip in one more question before our time is up, or maybe even two. Let's see where we go. Somebody from the audience wanted to talk about the dreaded word pests, and I think we're probably, from the discussion so far, we're going to be reassessing that word. But obviously with the food growing side of things, there is an aspect of making sure there's some food for us and for wildlife. So how do we manage those crops, those plants, with respect for the other creatures that might want to be eating them?
Well, I think, so, it's quite a big question. I think that the starting point is, for me, accepting that we're never, and should never, be aiming to totally annihilate any kind of creatures, and rather trying to achieve a balance whereby there's enough to go around. There's a really good saying, and I'm not sure if I'm going to get totally accurate, one for the rook, one for the crow, one will wither and the other will grow. In my garden, it's more like 3 for the slugs and 1 for me, but the idea is that we are planting enough, understanding that we're not the only creatures here that need to feed, or have housing or whatever else it might be that these plants are used for by other creatures. And then also cultivating healthy ecosystems where there is a healthy balance rather than these kind of like booms in a certain pest. Stepping away from chemicals is a really great way to kickstart that, because then rather than relying on these chemicals to annihilate a creature, and then as soon as the chemical's gone, the creature might start coming back, we start to create these kind of really complex webs, which we were just talking about, which kind of self-regulate once they are well established. And it's a really beautiful and rewarding thing to experience as a grower when you start to see that actually things are like you know, balancing out and having the courage, I think, to sometimes stand back and allow a pest population to start to grow, for example, on broad beans, and then suddenly noticing that, oh, there's a lot of ladybirds appearing in my garden, and could that be because this pest population is drawing them in? Probably yes. And so then it kind of, I suppose, recalibrating our relationship with pests, as you said, I think is really important, rather than seeing them as just a threat to us. Are they food for someone else? What is their important role in this, and how can we create a space where we still get something out of it, but they get something too, because ultimately it's a collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to come in on that? Fergus?
It was interesting what happened at Dixter, because when we, Christo passed away in 2006, and then I'd, not immediately, but over a couple of years, stopped using chemicals. I mean, we were light on it anyway, but I just thought, I'm going to stop. And everybody started saying, well, what's going to happen with the green fly and the black fly and the rust and this and that and whatever? And so we had problems. We were a garden open to the public, so we had problems for the first year and the second year and the third year. Now, several years on, we don't even have to think about controlling anything, because there's this wonderful balance there. And exactly what Poppy was saying, and if things are munched a little bit and so on, so what? You know, we're in this, we're in this world where you're sharing that garden with other things. So it's about recalibrating, like you exactly said, but also, you know that there's a very healthy balance there. And then if we were having a problem with a plant, say that just succumbing to powdery mildew one year after another, because we'd probably stop growing that plant and then grow something else in its place. You know, and just move on to something that likes your situation. But we're a bit of a Marmite place, because you've got a sort of section of the garden, sort of visitors that come in and say, whoa, you know, this is not sort of, their hostas are being eaten and so on. Whereas other people come and say, look, this place is alive with insects. And I think that balance will shift as we go forward. People are thinking more and more about biodiversity and the planet and so on. Thank goodness for that. We used to get lots of complaints about the meadows, the long grass that we hadn't cut. We hardly get a complaint now. There's a few, but we hardly get a complaint.
I think there's a balance is a very, very key word. I think another one is patience. Because if you plant a new garden from scratch, often that first year is very challenging because there isn't an ecosystem. Second year, it'll be completely different because it'll be starting to regulate itself. And then observation and interaction is another one, because the very act of not being able to use slug bait, for instance, makes you more vigilant. So you're out there in the evening with a torch, watching your seedlings, and it's a totally different process that you go through. And a much more engaged one as a custodian of that place.
We're running out of time, but does anyone, Richard, do you want to come in on that?
Just simply that, I think it's a change in philosophy, isn't it? So, for example, it goes back to the football thing. We worked with this amazing guy called Peter Carney, who's a banner maker. He made the Hillsborough banner, actually, memorial banner, which is in the Design Museum now in London. But he got captivated by the wildflower story and made this Weeds to Wildflowers banner, which is about, again, changing people's perceptions, I suppose, really. But it is about getting it right at the start, and then you don't have the problems later on, really. I think that's the key for me. It's like, John's going to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, that seems like a really great place to stop. So thank you all for joining me today.